right, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, James. Thank you to our organizers and our hosts, and to all of you for being here in person and online. I'll jump right in. As we've heard, any, I think, honest assessment of 20th century Catholic theology would have to acknowledge the influence of Hans Urs von Balthasar, whose panoramic and often eccentric theological vision resulted in many major works in the fields of, for instance, theological aesthetics, Christology, spiritual theology, patristics, metaphysics, and others. Though considered something of a theological outsider for much of his career, Balthasar's thought has, nevertheless, long found an audience among popes. Francis, Benedict XVI, and John Paul II were all admirers of his work and drew on his theology, each in their own way. Perhaps due in part to this history of warm papal reception, his work has not generally been associated with what could be called reformist theological projects. Indeed, for many, as one scholar recently has put it, the name Balthasar signs a conservative agenda. While choosing to think of Balthasar simply as a conservative ultimately, I think, proves limiting in any number of ways, it would be especially unfortunate if such a perception prevented us from recognizing what was, in fact, a particularly bold ecclesiological vision with implications that extended to the very highest levels of the institutional church. For instance, Balthasar's celebrated 1952 work, Die Schleifung der Bastionen, Raising the Bastions, anticipated and influenced ideas that eventually predominated at the Second Vatican Council, such as the need for a more active role for the laity, as well as a greater theological emphasis on the interrelation of the church and the world. You can see here something of this represented in the quote. He says, in a general way, let us not therefore cling tightly to structures of thought, a truth that is merely handed on, without being thought anew from its very foundations, has lost its vital power. The vessel that holds it, whether this is practice or doctrine or image, becomes dusty, rusts, crumbles away, and one day the storm that blows the dried up branch away will no longer be delayed. And this collapse, when it comes, will not be great, because what collapses will have been a hollow shell for a very long time. Nor, in addition to this emphasis on the need for reform, nor was Balthasar the least bit blind to the depths of the church's sinfulness. In fact, Balthasar goes decidedly further than a lot of his pre-conciliar contemporaries in insisting that the church was not only incidentally capable of sin through its individual members, but that it sinned as church, and therefore ecclesial repentance was to be part of the church from its very beginning, through to its final purification. A teaching that would go on to find some form of expression in, for instance, Lumen Gentium 8's call for continuous penance and renewal. Some 22 years after the book just quoted from, after the end of the Second Vatican Council and during the pontificate of Paul VI, Balthasar would publish another major work on the church, Der antirömische Affekt, or the anti-Roman attitude, which I would like to focus on today. In it, one finds his most sustained attempt at articulating a theology of the papacy, and by extension, a theology of ecclesial power, and so, implicitly, the conditions for reforming such power. In particular, Balthasar is concerned to respond to a number of polemical criticisms of the institutional church, and in particular of the papacy, that were, let's say, in vogue after the council. Amidst fashionable complaints about the magisterium's paternalistic style and know-it-all attitude, as Hans Kung put it at the time, and calls for even an anarchical church free from any form of organized authority, as another contemporary German theologian was putting it, Balthasar detected echoes of what he called a much older anti-Roman attitude. That ran from the young Newman to Luther, all the way back to the early Christian community at Corinth. Indeed, Balthasar writes, the anti-Roman attitude is as old as the Roman Empire. Though he ultimately believes such attitudes go beyond the spirit of healthy reform and must be countered, it is significant, I think, that Balthasar does not dismiss these anti-Roman attitudes out of hand. Indeed, he acknowledges the church's often, he puts it, shady history has bred a legitimate degree of mistrust, nor does he deny the church's tendency to, quote, misuse the supreme evangelical authority given to her for service in order to impose legalistic obedience on the people, end quote, especially, he says, through sinful combination with violent secular power. These many unquestionably dreadful aspects of church history, Balthasar says, must be deplored and repudiated. But to stop there at this vision of a sinful historical church would be to content oneself with what he calls a merely sociological understanding of church power, which can see it only as one long history of domination and exploitation. For Balthasar, there are many approaches that stop short in this way. For instance, a certain kind of demythologizing historical critical method, the arrogant view, as he sees it, of a mass media that can only see the church, ironically, as yet another bureaucratic human institution. But also, I think interestingly, he criticizes those romantic Christians who yearn to return to a supposedly pure, he calls it hypostasized, pre-Pentecostal Christianity before the introduction of large coordinating structures and the tensions inherent to them. Each of these approaches, in its own way, minimizes or ignores the background mystery underlying the visible structures of the church, which is ultimately a Christological mystery. For before the church was a socio-psychological reality, it was a theological one, called into being by Christ and bearing the imprint of his mission. The main task of Der Antirömische Effekt is to suggest how that mission relates to, and indeed is expressed through, different offices in the church, including especially the office of the papacy. In this way, I think we can understand this book as Balthasar's attempt to, as he put it in the earlier quote, rethink the papacy anew from its very foundations, so as to help prevent it crumbling under the weight of scorn, scandal, and indeed, the ignominy of its own history. And this is perhaps summed up in the quote we have here, where he explains his intentions in this book. However, before proceeding to consider the arguments of this book in more detail, we might briefly ask whether the defense of church structures that Balthasar undertakes in 1974 signals some kind of turn away from the clear reformist impulses that we saw represented before the council. Does he eventually prove himself to be a conservative in this sense, after all? To this, I believe it's necessary to answer in the negative, for two reasons, at least. First, because he explicitly rejects as nonsensical the division of humanity and the church into a left and a right, and seeks instead to provide a theological framework for what he calls greater cooperation and heartfelt like-mindedness in ecclesial affairs. It would therefore, I think, be strained, if not dishonest, a strained, if not dishonest reading that insisted on seeing him as some kind of post-conciliar partisan actor. Second, and perhaps more importantly, Balthasar's defense of church structures is by no means, as we will see, an argument for impunity or undue deference. The theological basis that he finds for office, in fact, amounts to a rather high standard, one that attempts to render intelligible the objective criteria by which we might be able to judge office holders in the church. An argument in defense of authority is by no means an argument for authoritarian license, in other words. But to return specifically to the anti-Roman attitude, It is inherent to the church because it is a response to the presence of a certain form of power that is proper to the church. Here, Balthasar says, quote, the exousia that Jesus entrusts to the 12 on choosing them, for instance, at Mark chapter 3, which can be expressed, he says, in Latin only as potestas and in English as authority, makes it futile to try to get around the problem of power in the church. Likewise, though, would it be dishonest to render that authority narrowly and exclusively in terms of service, since, he says, the people of God benefit from a service only when authority is effectively present. For instance, in the administration of the sacraments, the ensuring of authentic proclamation, and so on. To be sure, such authority does not refer back to itself. It is not earned out of any special merit, as Peter's own repeated failures amply demonstrate, but received as a grace that shares in the Christological task of mediating the way to the Father. For this same reason, it cannot be understood as an absolute or self-sufficient authority, much less one meant for domination. As Paul explains to the Corinthians, authority in the church is meant for building up and not for tearing down. But such authority has been specifically allocated, a point to which Balthasar ascribes the utmost theological significance. So if the presence of authoritative church structures is therefore not a result of a cynical effort by later historical actors to somehow capture or contain the force of Christ's saving message, but an integral feature of the community Christ himself established in order to proclaim, maintain, and instantiate that message in history. It is here where we touch on the most enduring feature of the anti-Römische effect, which is the idea of a Christological constellation, that is, a constitutive group surrounding and drawn together by Jesus, apart from which he, Jesus, cannot be properly understood. Just as, Balthasar says, one sole human being would be a contradiction in terms, so too is the God-man Jesus Christ unrecognizable, detached from the personal relationships that gave structure to his life and mission. While acknowledging a larger cast of characters from which one could draw, including Joseph, Mary Magdalene, James, and even Judas, Balthasar emphasizes 5 individuals as the most important within the constellation. That is, John the Baptist, the Virgin Mary, Peter, and John, the beloved disciple, who of course exist alongside the rest of the 12, and Paul, though born out of time, nevertheless receiving a pivotal office for which he was directly chosen by the Lord. So these figures, for Balthasar, are integral to Christology, since each plays an indispensable role in effectuating Jesus' mission. The Baptist by preparing the ground for Jesus' mission and helping to nurture it in him. Balthasar shares the majority view of scholars here that Jesus was likely a disciple of John's at some point. Mary by bearing him into the world and setting the context for all subsequent relations. The 12 by sharing in his life, mission, and authority, and Paul by universalistic mediation of Christ's mission beyond the immediate circle of disciples. And since there can be no Christological fact that does not also have a bearing on ecclesiology, these figures become theological prototypes or real symbols constituting lasting offices within the church. The Baptist as the ultimate prophet, Mary as the exemplar of lay holiness, John as the embodiment of intimate personal love of Christ, Peter, the shepherd, and Paul, the symbol of flexible apostolic service. If Balthasar's typological constellation has the advantage of establishing ecclesiological categories on a firm Christological basis, It also provides resources for guarding against what he calls abstract notions of unity in the church. Mary does not relate to Jesus in exactly the same way as Peter. The beloved disciple casts light on the mystery of Christ differently than Paul does. And yet, all reveal components of Christian truth and constitute differentiated aspects of the true Catholica, the unity in difference that ultimately serves as a mode of Trinitarian presence to history. We see here, I think, a clear precursor to Pope Francis's famous image of the church as a polyhedron, which reflects the convergence of all its parts, each of which preserves its distinctiveness. Perhaps more profoundly, we also see here Balthasar's attempt to draw on scriptural figures and archetypes to ground not only a potential program of church reform, but a broader theological vision of revelation itself as differentiated, relational, and polyhedral. With regards to the prospects of church leadership and structure, the importance of the constellation would clearly seem to preclude any kind of anarchic leveling of structures for the purposes of establishing an amorphous brotherhood along recognizably democratic or egalitarian lines. But so too would it preclude Peter, for instance, acting out monarchically or in contravention of other legitimate ecclesial missions. To speak more about the Petrine office, Balthasar identifies three legitimate aspects of Peter's office, with each aspect in turn giving rise to its own kind of tension. First, Peter represents the ideal realization of unity among the faithful, which expresses the communio grounded in faith and love that characterizes the church as such. In particular, Peter is, Balthasar calls him, the permanent exponent of the apostolic order, having received in its entirety that authority, or exousia, which Christ intended to the 12 collegially. Thus, a tension arises between the formal principles of collegiality and primacy, a point on which Lumen Gentium, in Balthasar's view, achieved a satisfactory balance, but could never hope to definitively resolve. Second, since among this apostolic order discord will inevitably arise, communio organically focuses to a concentrated point called power, which in this context has no other purpose, Balthasar says, than to preserve or speedily restore the unity that has been lost, the unity in love that has been lost by egoism and division. It is this power that Peter is said to legitimately yield. There is a tension here between fruitful disagreement and satanic contradiction, which it will always be incumbent upon Peter to try and parse, and, incidentally, for which Balthasar suggests Ignatian discernment can be a valuable resource. But the essential point is that power is not some heteronymous principle imposed on love, but a natural aspect of love's preservation beyond its historical point of origin. And finally, given Peter's office is directed to the preservation and final victory of love, it is, properly speaking, eschatological and soteriological in nature. By presenting and representing the church to itself as the church of love, Peter's office marks the church as a truly spiritual community, which, though sinful, is on the pilgrim path to redemption. Ecclesia semper reformanda. Thus, Peter bears a particular responsibility for the scandalous tension between the earthly and the heavenly church, and his office is never more truly fulfilled than when he shows himself to be for and with the sinners whom God wishes to reconcile to God's divine mercy. Balthasar calls this Peter's eccentricity, excentricitat, that is, his being centered outside of himself, and his freedom to step forward from the center to the margins, not in order to denounce, but for the sake of ever greater integration within the communio of love. And though he does not say so explicitly at this point in the book, I think Balthasar would also see the Jesuit fourth vow of obedience with regards to mission in light of this Petrine eccentricity. At the same time, Peter's power is not absolute, and his legitimate authority does not mean he can carry out his office in isolation. The ecclesiastical power structure is not, according to Balthasar, like a pyramid, which in any case only Jesus would stand atop, but rather a multidimensional reality, a network of tensions that play off of one another and balance one another in distinct and overlapping ways. So, for instance, Peter's office needs the intimate Johannine love of Christ as its ballast and measure, lest office become cut off from its own animating force. Mary, for her part, constitutes the beginning and center, Balthasar says, of the church. Her office, in fact, predates Peter's, and her pure and ready consent to God continues to express the identity of the church more perfectly than does his role as shepherd. James, not one of the central figures, but part of the constellation, James and Paul represent, respectively, complementary poles of tradition and law on the one hand, and adaptation or flexibility to mission on the other, and in this way provide necessary dialogue partners for Peter in furtherance of his mission. Thus, finally, Balthasar says, quote, Peter must be continually learning. He too must take his bearings by the all-encompassing totality of the church, which expresses itself concretely in the dynamic interplay of her major missions and in the laws inherent in her structure, end quote. In other words, Balthasar's position seems to require that Peter, as much as any other member of the church, learn sentire cum ecclesia. Balthasar goes on to deploy this typological account to great effect. For instance, it allows him to offer a reasonable critique of papal overreach without rejecting papal power as such, as when he faults Paul VI, not so much for the content of Humanae Vitae, but the decision to issue such a hard teaching in the form of a universally binding encyclical. Here, he says, Peter holds up for the whole church what is a Johannine eschatological ideal, and thus invites a predictable storm of indignation. Likewise, an awareness of the constellation dynamic guards against the worst forms of magisterial censure, such as those that were on display during the modernist crisis, for instance, when Peter resorts to summary condemnation or secret proceedings in order to stifle what could be valuable intellectual dialogue, then his authority appears as an imposition, and he must remember Paul's admonition that Christian authority is properly understood as mutual filial correction, a form of help rather than discipline. At other times, the typological superstructure of the book is frustratingly enlisted to justify preoccupations which can appear idiosyncratic and even arbitrary, such as Balthasar's insistence on discussing the Marian and Petrine offices in terms of the feminine and masculine principles. Perhaps most importantly, however, Balthasar's approach allows him to locate the perennial anti-Roman attitude within the wider play of forces that exist within the church, and thus open up a way of thinking about ecclesial tension that connects to our own time. This is because the anti-Roman attitude has never really abated in the years since Balthasar's death. But nor have we learned to contextualize these feelings within the broader picture of ecclesial communio that he envisioned, one in which both commanding and obeying would take place in a spirit of shared commitment and responsibility to Christ. If anything, I would suggest, one effect of the papacies of John Paul II and Benedict XVI was to further isolate the Petrine office, whether through doctrinal retrenchment, disciplinary zeal, or exalted personal styles. And if, for the past 12 years, the anti-Roman attitude has belonged once more to right-wing elements within the church than to ecclesial anarchists or discontented progressives, the threat of division and disintegration has not, for that reason, been any less acute. In this sense, we stand even now in the same post-conciliar breach that Balthasar did, where the primary task is the practical integration of the people of God with the responsible leadership established by Christ, an integration that, according to Balthasar, Vatican II opened the way to, but still remains to be fully realized. If one were to take Balthasar as a guide here, then the key to this kind of reform would consist of the effort to re-embed Peter among the Christological constellation. For instance, through a more deliberate practice of collegiality between Pope and bishops, and the visible orientation of the papacy towards the Johannine charisma of love. In this way, Peter's legitimate authority would appear not as an imposition from outside, but as an organic aspect of the cohesive ecclesial structure. And laity and leadership would be better able to proceed together down the shared missionary path. Looking back at Pope Francis's pontificate, I think it is easy to see his program of reform as an attempt at this kind of reintegration, whether it be in his efforts at implementing synodality, his general refusal to use doctrine as a weapon of discipline, his attempts to build bridges between the margins and the center, or his Johannine emphasis on closeness and love. Synodality in particular seems to have been Francis's answer to Balthasar's question, posed towards the end of, but hanging over the whole of the book that we've been discussing. Quote, how can we contribute to the spiritual deepening of authority itself? The spiritual deepening of authority itself. More specifically, Balthasar even anticipates and recommends Francis's synodal strategy of convening and participating in such deliberative gatherings, but not entering into the discussion in order to advance one particular opinion in opposition to others. Thus, can Peter strengthen unity precisely by protecting the differentiated freedoms and missions of all members? A vision of papal power, which, whatever else we might say about it, is quite different from monarchic prerogative. Whether the Petrine office can continue to successfully reform itself in this way is now a question that confronts Leo XIV, but it is a question I suggest that Balthasar was asking already in 1974. In closing, let me suggest that the value of Balthasar's approach lies in the resources it provides for thinking about the church as a dynamic field of tension, and thus always and necessarily a site of discernment of missions. There can be no comprehensive a priori program of reform because this field of tension is also, by definition, a field of freedom, and because the demands of historical and cultural specificity will always need to be taken into account. And while the church is not reducible to a single personality or power, this does not mean that power as such is alien to it. Instead, the deepest kind of reform would consist in showing how both authority and power can justify their place in the order of love, and so point to the one who has established that order for the sake of our redemption and our freedom. It is this task, I suggest, that Balthasar helps us reckon with even still today. Thank you for your attention.
So good afternoon, everybody, ladies, gentlemen. Thank you for this invitation. It's a long trip from Chile to here. I'm very glad to be here. Well, the Jesuit Karl Rahner has been regarded as one of the most important Catholic theologians of the 20th century. His contribution to the Second Vatican Council has been especially emphasized, not only due to his direct involvement as apparatus, but also owing to the influence of his work on the theological renewal already underway in the years leading up to the Council. In the final years of his life, Karl Rahner himself emphasized the importance of the Ignatian tradition for his theology. In 1978, Rahner stated that Ignatian spirituality seemed to him more significant and more important for his theology than any other influence. That same year, he published Ignatius of Loyola Speaks to a Modern Jesuit, in which he personifies the saint and founder of the order. Rahner considered this text a resume of his theology in general and of how he tried to live. Later, only a few weeks before his death, he wrote in Experiences of a Catholic Theologian, "I hope, for example, that the great father of my order, Ignatius of Loyola, has granted me that some small portion of his spirit and of his unique spirituality is noticeable in my theology. Such is at least my hope. I am even of the somewhat immodest opinion that in this or that point I stand closer to Ignatius than the great Jesuit theology of the Baroque period." So in this presentation, I will attempt to respond to two questions. First, how does Karl Rahner understand Ignatian spirituality? And second, building on the above, how is this understanding of Ignatian spirituality reflected on his theological work? So to address the first question, we may turn to the explicitly Ignatian writings of the author. While they are numerous, I would like to highlight three in particular: the Ignatian mysticism of joy in the world, the logic of concrete individual knowledge in Ignatius Loyola, and Ignatius of Loyola Speaks to a Modern Jesuit. Each separated by approximately 20 years, these three texts represent distinct moments in Rahner's theological trajectory. I shall summarize Rahner's main ideas on Ignatian spirituality in this text in 6 key points. First, Karl Rahner understands Ignatian spirituality as a form of mysticism or mystagogy in continuity with the long spiritual tradition of the Church, which he had already explored in his earlier research. He pays particular attention to the concept of the spiritual senses and to the practice of discernment. Second, the God of Ignatius is the Deus semper maior, the one who transcends the world, in relation to whom all things are relative and from whom at the same time they receive their value. He is the infinite God who in love has willed to communicate himself to the world. Rahner speaks of the mystery toward which the human person is oriented. Third, Ignatian spirituality, as Rahner understands it, is marked by a profound attention to the individual person, exemplified in the method of the exercises. The foundation of this attentiveness lies in the conviction that God communicates uniquely with each person and that the individual is capable of experiencing this self-communication of God. For Rahner, this conviction is the very essence of Ignatian spirituality. From this personal encounter, one may discern God's individual will for each person. Fourth, the fundamental orientation of Ignatian action is to help souls. Alongside this, the universality of the Jesuit missionary vocation, what today we might call going to the frontiers, challenges conceptual boundaries in both theological reflection and pastoral practice. Fifth, the following of the poor and humble Jesus is the particular manner in which Ignatius and his companions lived their discipleship. The contemplations in the exercises form the basis for this following. The call of the king and the three degrees of humility serve to characterize Jesus as poor and humble. This implies a preferential stance of marginality in relation to civil and ecclesial power. Rahner views the history of his order, of the Jesuits, critically in this regard. Sixth, finally, for Rahner, a hallmark of Ignatian spirituality is the fidelity to the concrete church of one's own time, a fidelity that does not preclude but rather requires a critical distance. Because the church is loved and acknowledged as the body of Christ, it too must be challenged in the light of the one absolute, who is the God of Jesus Christ. So to the second question, I believe that these elements of Ignatian spirituality, as understood by Rahner, can be found throughout his theological work, either as content or as a recurring question, or as theological attitudes. As far as the content is concerned, rather than searching for Ignatian influences in many parts of Rahner's work, which are certainly abundant, I think it is more appropriate to ask about the presence of Ignatian spirituality at the center of his theology. Nevertheless, some caution is needed when speaking of a center in Rahner's work. In my view, his theology cannot be reduced to a single foundational idea that simply unfolds across various fields, since first, his body of work is vast and diverse. Second, much of it consists of short essays written at the request of others and not following an organized plan. So, Theology d'occasion. And third, Rahner himself expresses skepticism toward all-encompassing systems of thought. Ultimately, Rahner conceives of his theology as a contribution to the Church's ongoing reflection through history, rather than as an autonomous project. For these reasons, when speaking of a center in Karl Rahner's theology, we can only refer to a particularly significant core idea, but not a common denominator for the entirety of his work. With this caveat, I agree with Roman Siebenrock's formulation, which identifies grace as God's self-communication in Christ as the heart of the theology of Karl Rahner. Rahner himself, when asked about the center of his theology, replied, "That can't be anything else but God as mystery, and Jesus Christ, the crucified and risen one, and the historical event in which this God turns irreversibly toward us in self-communication. So in principle, you can't name just one center." Speaking of grace at the center of Rahner's theology does not refer to the treatise on grace as a subsection of dogmatics, but rather to grace as Rahner understands it. This theological core consists in God's self-communication or self-giving to the creature. It refers to the direct relationship between God and each person, as expressed in annotation 15 of the spiritual exercises, and to love as mutual communication and self-gift, as portrayed in the contemplation to attain love. Throughout Rahner's theological work, this theme appears again and again in the form of a question. How does this communication between God and the creature actually happen? As Siebenrock notes, this communication moves in two directions. God gives himself to the creature as self-communication, uncreated grace, incarnation, glory, and the creature, enabled by this divine gift, is made capable of responding in love, transcendence, supernatural, existential. So Rahner's first published essay, Warum uns das Gebet not tut, written at the age of just 20, already deals with personal relationship with God and hints at annotation 15 of the exercises. His early work on patristic and medieval spiritual theology reveals a special concern for personal spiritual experience. Spirit in the World focuses on the experience of encounter with the mystery of God. Rahner writes, "The highest knowledge of God is the darkness of ignorance," and Spirit in the World ends by locating Jesus Christ at the center of this communication. In the 1930s, Words into Silence and Hearers of the Word explored the human being's communication with God, the person who speaks to God in prayer without receiving a direct response and yet is structurally a hearer of a possible word in Christ or from God. Rahner's theology of grace in all its variations points toward this self-giving of God and the human response, both deeply intertwined. Rahner placed particular emphasis against the Jesuit theological tradition since Suarez on the idea that grace can be experienced. From him, this experiential quality was fundamental to spiritual discernment in the Ignatian sense, especially in recognizing the divine origin of certain interior movements, consolations. It is a question of the communication of God himself, as in consolation without previous cause, and the consolation of his will, as in certain consolations with a cause. Rahner's Trinitarian theology expresses this self-communication of God through the Word and the Spirit, on the one hand in the objectivity of history and its signs, incarnation, Jesus Christ, church, sacraments, and on the other in the subjectivity of the human heart, spiritual senses, discernment, charisms, conscience. Even Mariology is understood within the broader context of God's communication with the world, and in particular with the human being, as seen in the wide framework Rahner sketches at the beginning of his book, Mary, Mother of the Lord. His Ecclesiology presents Christ and the Church together as the one great sacrament, unum magnum sacramentum, of God's self-communication to the world. Grace that seeks to become flesh in the world. Within the same ecclesiological field, there are many of Rahner's articles on the importance of personalizing the Christian faith, grounded not merely in learned doctrine, but in lived experience. If God communicates with each person in a unique way, personal charisms must be respected and valued in the Church. In Christology, alongside his transcendental Christology, one must also recall his attention to the mysteries of Jesus' life, his writings on particular discipleship, and on personal love for Jesus. So as we can see, this question of God's self-communication with the Creator is a recurring theme in Rahner's theology. Its roots can be traced back to the experience of such communication in the spiritual exercises. In addition, I would like to highlight certain Ignatian attitudes in his theological approach. I believe that the influence of Ignatian spirituality in Karl Rahner's theology should not be sought only in specific contents, but also in his way of doing theology. First of all, the pastoral sense of his theology reveals the apostolic concern of Ignatius and his first companions to help souls. As Rahner himself once stated in an interview, very generally and simply, I would say that behind everything I have done, there stands an immediate pastoral and spiritual interest. End of the quote. It is the same attitude Rahner attributes to Ignatius with regard to theology in the Society of Jesus, in Ignatius of Loyola Speaks, try to develop a theology that will find a hearing among people today and that can reach their hearts. Rahner's efforts to reinterpret traditional Christian concepts and ideas such as indulgences, concupiscence, uncreated grace, etc., were aimed at ensuring that the Christian message could truly reach and commend the men and women of his time in a meaningful and intelligible way. Secondly, in the Society of Jesus, that pastoral attitude is marked by a universal scope. It involves a readiness to go to the most remote frontiers. The same disposition that led the first Jesuits to venture in the American continent or the distant islands of Asia also motivated Rahner to engage in dialogue with Marxism, with other religious traditions, Christian denominations, and with non-believers. His thesis on anonymous Christians is a clear sign of this universal concern. In Ignatius of Loyola Speaks, Rahner seems to speak of himself when defending the anthropology of the early probabilist Jesuits, linking it to the mission in China and India. That anthropology, perhaps overly optimistic, as Rahner said, would anticipate the anthropological foundation needed for a church that wants to be a church to the entire world and to all cultures, and that refrains from selling European Christianity as an export article to the rest of the world. A third Ignatian attitude is the radical distinction between God as the only absolute and the corresponding indifference toward all created things, as expressed in the principle and foundation of the spiritual exercises. For Rahner, God is the holy mystery, which must not be confused with human discourses about him. From his unique absolute, everything else becomes relative. This relativization appears, for example, in his view of the church, but also in his intellectual eclecticism. In a letter to Louise Rinser, Rahner sharply states, "I am a relativist in relation to everything that can be stated, said, identified, possessed, or defined, because all of that is not God and is truly only relative, that is, it points to him. And this relativism is the truth, for it is the truth of life which anticipates and fulfills the relativization of everything through death." End of the quote. Only God is absolute, everything else may be questioned. The only exception may be the neighbor, the fellow human being, since love of Jesus, love of God, and love of the other appear as deeply interconnected in his theology. Finally, I would emphasize a fourth attitude, the Ecclesial Ignatian character of Rahner's thinking. With his theology, Rahner wanted to contribute to the church becoming what it is called to be. But this fidelity also required a critical view of its institutional reality. Some words of Rahner to Louise Rinser vividly illustrate this attitude. One can only struggle against the church from within the church, and to the extent that one grows into it and loves it as it is. You see how reactionary I am, but I have always been that way. If God himself has become flesh and remains flesh, then the absolute exists only in the terribly poor, concrete form of the conditioned, from which one may not, or perhaps only lovingly and comprehensively, distance oneself. In summary, Rahner explicitly recognized the influence of Ignatian spirituality on his theological work. Its traces can be discerned from his earliest writings. This relevance is especially evident in a question or recurring theme throughout his career: how the encounter, dialogue, and direct communication between God and his creature, particularly the human being, takes place. This theme is intimately linked to the heart of his theology, grace at God's self-communication in Christ. Nevertheless, I believe that Ignatian influence should not only be sought in contents, but also in Ignatian attitudes, in his theological approach, the pastoral and universal outlook of his thought, the radical distinction between the absoluteness of God and Ignatian indifference toward everything else, and his faithful yet critical ecclesiality. Thank you very much for your hearing.
So we have about 35 minutes, I think, for questions or comments or observations or whatever whatever you want to bring up into this conversation. Matthew.
So, Travis, thank you. You almost persuaded me that von Balthasar could be a source for reform, and I was serious, so that was good. And particularly, and I'm thinking about Pope Francis, and the language of a field of tensions. That it reminded me of Romano Guardini, who, as you know, Pope Francis never finished his dissertation. I was a doctoral director. It's the worst outcome. But because, Guardini has a similar sort of notion that there are these Gegensätze or polarities and you can't reduce them. And I can't imagine that von Balthasar didn't write or respond to Guardini. But so the question, could you talk a little bit about the relationship between Guardini's and von Balthasar on this issue of these sort of polarities in that's not.
Thank you for that question. Well, so there's a few things there. I think the influence of Guardini, both on Balthasar and on Francis, is significant and interesting. I think Francis didn't finish the dissertation on Guardini, but he did finish a number of articles in which he uses Balthasar quite explicitly on the question of the church as a differentiated unity and difference, field of tension, and these kinds of things. And so early on, we see him going to sources in Balthasar for a lot of these actual substantive ideas. And I think it's one of the pieces of the Balthasarian ressourcement that I think is quite necessary to do at this point, which is to say that it's not just John Paul and Benedict who have elevated and incorporated Balthasar's theology into the magisterial infrastructure. It's also Francis, and I think we really have to see large parts of his vision of reform in light of that view of tension and difference. I don't know how much I want to say or can say specifically to the question of the relationship of the three of them or the influence of Guardini kind of in and through either of them. I think clearly it's very important for both. I think that field of tension theme for Balthasar, it's not a single source, right? I mean, this is a very Ignatian theme that he finds, I think, again and again. And it's also a dramatic theme that I think really comes in and through, or comes out of a lot of his interest in the dramatic form. As with a lot of these figures, but I think especially with Balthasar, the engagement with any other particular figure is going to reflect especially the interests that he's bringing to the table. And it seems to me he's always interested in finding a way of preserving distinctiveness, different characters in the drama, and resisting the flattening out of that tension. And I think in relation to church reform, this is a very important thing to keep in mind, because both the reformist and the, let's say, conservative impulses can tend towards that flattening of tension in different ways.
Thank you very much to both of you for two wonderful presentations. I have a question for Travis about Balthasar's Christological constellation, the Ecclesial types. Some 20 years before Durante Romische effect, in 1954, Eric Chavara published a commentary on John's Gospel, Christentum gemäß Johannes, in which he laid out his own schema of a biblical typology that was fourfold. So he identifies the beloved disciple, John, as the contemplative complement to Peter's apostolic place, and then for women, identifies Mary as the contemplative complement, again, kind of in partnership with the beloved disciple, the contemplative complement to Mary Magdalene as the apostle to the apostles. And I've always wondered why Balthasar, who must have been familiar with Chavara's work, jettisons basically Mary Magdalene. He relegates her to a place of lesser prominence in his constellation. He does mention her there in Durante Romische effect, but says she's in the shadow along with several other women of Mary. So I wonder what you make of all of this, and whether or not you think that broadening Balthasar's constellation, and perhaps particularly by way of Mary Magdalene as a feminine instance of apostolicity, is worthwhile.
Thank you, Henry. I think that's well taken. I mean, I think it's interesting in these concepts of, especially and frequently in Balthasar, you have schemas or whatever that appear and reappear. And my general feeling is one can always quibble with the way that the details are filled in, right? And the pictures or that he paints. And in this case in particular, he's making choices about who to include and who to exclude. And I think, as he introduces the constellation, he's very, it seems to me, clear to say that there is quite a large cast of characters. He spends a lot of time talking about Judas and then moves on, And so I think these characters, a strong case can be made for the importance of a lot of them. I think he wants to focus on what he sees as the most important, the most enduring, and the most sort of integral to a fuller account of Christology. Might he be wrong that Mary Magdalene could, not play more of a role in that? Certainly. And of course, the question of Balthasar and women is always a fraught one. So that's why I say I think some of the masculine feminine stuff is playing out even in the constellation, maybe especially in the constellation, in ways that are not always helpful. But some people have been interested in this same point. Others have pointed out that he maybe neglects certain characters, such as Mary Magdalene. I think my general feeling is to say we can use this structure and enrich it beyond what he himself, commits himself to. And if we're doing that, then he's already kind of, made his point, which is that if we go and reflect on the characters in the constellation, we reflect on their relationship to the basic Christological mission, then we are, we're doing the project that he sets out in this book, which is to think about how those missions might persist and matter to the contemporary church. So in that sense, he's what he described himself as, I think, in the beginning of the Theodrama. He's an apparatus upon which future theologians can exercise their own inclinations. But he sets up, I think, a useful structure to start to do that.
Thank you very much to both of you. I will have a question for Travis. I found your paper very, very inspiring, especially on reframing a reading of Balthasar. So thank you very much for that. I have a question still, maybe more to Balthasar than yourself, but maybe you can help me to understand better. It's about the exousia, the potestas, or authority. I was wondering, because in Balthasar constellation, I was wondering if something was not missing to better understand the concept of authority, which is the people of God. Because the authority in this scheme looks more like something coming only from God, where in the gospel, the authority is acknowledged to Jesus by the crowd. It comes from God, but it needs this moment of acknowledgement from the crowd. And then you can see that in the Acts of the Apostles, seeing the role of the crowd, acknowledging the authority, which is not the final point, because the crowd can also withdraw the authority acknowledgement from Jesus and from Peter, etc. So is there something within Balthasar considering this? Because this is my problem with Balthasar, the only one I have, is his relationship with the authority coming only from God.
Thank you for that question. I think without denying the premise, it seems to me that in fact the danger you're pointing to is precisely in some ways what the point of the constellation is, which is to say that the authority that he's talking about is constituted in the constellation and through the constellation, which is to say collectively, relationally, we might even say popularly, and that it must be maintained and preserved in that same way. And I really think that, I mean, he's sympathetic to Paul VI very clearly, I think, but I think he sees the papacy under profound stress at the time of this book. And I think he is interested in giving an account of papal power which is not top-down, which is not sort of self-justifying as simply from God and so on. And this is the point of the reintegration of Peter into the constellation. So it's my sense that he would take this point very much in stride. I tend to think that, I mean, this is a frequent criticism of Balthasar, is that his theology appears from on high or emphasizes a kind of verticality, and therefore perhaps neglects a certain sensitivity to historical or political conditions. I don't find that ultimately that convincing as I look at sort of the general thrust of Balthasar's recurrent theological preoccupations, especially with regards to the church. I think he's conservative, arguably, on any number of particular issues, but he really is interested in an account of communio, and really can only understand the church as constituted in and through that kind of communio, which reorients the church, or reorients all sorts of terms in the context of the church, including power. So, yeah, I think he wants to avoid calling it or equating power with service in a way that would then lose sight of the fact of authority. But it seems to me that the communal, and I guess the word here I would insist upon is relational constitution of authority, is what he sees as most important in the scriptural source and for the ecclesiological schema that he draws from that. I think maybe at times, you know, your point is probably clearer to, or more fair than others, you know, in how he puts it at any given moment. But it seems to me the overall thrust of the constellation is to try to address a concern precisely like that one.
I have a question to Hernan. critics of Rahner who are within the Rahner movement, you might say, around this area. Is it the case that some Rahnerian literature would dispute Rahner's claims to be so univocally influenced by Ignatius? I know you've said that in part of what you were saying, but if you could expand a little bit. I don't want to hazard my guesses. I'm not that accurate on, alternative major influences that and the fact that Rahner seemed to stress this more towards the end of his life. But then the particular criticism of Metz, of Rahner, and if it's as if Metz was a good Jesuit arguing for which he wasn't, of course, but I'm just saying that Metz was making a point that some Jesuits might make, which is that, again, it's this historical, empirical end to the theology, the physical. So anyway, if there's something almost Jesuit-like in the criticism Metz makes of Rahner.
Well, actually, there is even during Rahner's lifetime, there was this debate: what should be the best point from which we should understand Rahner's theology. Peter Eicher is a very important figure in this sense, with the philosophical influences of Rahner. On the other hand, there was Klaus-Peter Fischer with the Ignatian spirituality as an important influence for Rahner. I think, well, I would say two things. First of all, I would say Rahner is his theology is an eclecticism. He's mixing many things, not necessarily in a reflexive way. He's using what he has close to him in order to say what he wants to say. And I don't remember where, but I think in an interview, Rahner is asked about the influence of Teilhard de Chardin in his own theology, in Rahner's theology. And he said, actually, I must say, I haven't read Teilhard de Chardin, but this doesn't mean that he doesn't has an influence in my theology, have an influence in my theology. Because I'm hearing what is in the atmosphere and in conversations. So it's not easy to find the links between Ignatian spirituality and a theological work. And I was thinking this could be a question for all the theologians we are talking about. Arno Zallauer, another scholar on Rahner, says that Ignatius of Loyola is a productive model, productives Vorbild for Rahner. And I think it is, but we could also ask if Ignatius is not a projection surface for Rahner, as for every Jesuit theologian. I myself, I'm a Jesuit theologian, so it's my danger too. And it's a circle. I think we can't go out of this circle. What we put on Ignatius and what we receive from him. This is probably the problem at the end.
Thank you. I'm conscious that a lot of the questions, in fact, all of the questions so far are coming from the speakers. I've just sent a message to everyone online saying, have they got a question or an observation? Then I realized I sent it to myself. So I'm now saying publicly, if anyone other than the speakers have a question or an insight that they want to share, please do. This is the sensus fidelium. You have the grace. There is no question that's so stupid. You've heard a lot of those already. Don't worry. Don't worry. And if you haven't got a question, I've certainly got questions. Okay?
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question for Travis. In your presentation, there's 3 points in Patreon's office. The third point is about, there's a word very inspiring. It's called eccentricity. And I may miss some point of it. I may want to ask for a clarification, whether it means like walking from the center to the peripheral, and is it means there's when there's certain kind of discrepancy or a range of thought that we have to have certain kind of inclusiveness. And then I also want to ask for the inclusiveness problem, whether the peripheral is the progressive thought or the center is the progressive thought. It's like we are trying to put all our concentration or focus or energy to try to push at the center, or we are trying to extend ourselves like to the peripheral. So, like two kind of thought, like which one is in the middle, which one we pay more attention to. And yes, I have a very big interest in synodality. How like if people doing decisions, not decision or discernment under the influence of Holy Spirit, but in a collective way, like who should be included, like who should be like not included. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Those are some excellent questions. So a few thoughts. Yeah, on eccentricity, it's a strange feature of Balthasar's account of Peter, because I think in some ways we can think of the figure of Peter as representing some kind of, you know, you are my rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, some firm center of the church, with all the sort of doctrinal implications that may conjure. But it seems to me Balthasar's position or point with this eccentricity is that Peter should have less of a sense of his own view of what the church must be, then he should have a concern for preserving the freedom, the legitimate freedom within certain boundaries of the church to exist in its multiplicity. This is, of course, a dynamic, right? It can't be one way or the other. And this, I suppose, is to the second question or point, right? Is the progressive element on the periphery or in the center? I mean, we have to use these terms, progressive or conservative or something, but you know, they become frustrating terms at a certain point. I think what Balthasar would want to say is that it's in that going back and forth between center and periphery that any hope of true progress, maybe we could say progress with a lowercase p rather than some kind of progressive energy, you know, it's in that back and forth that progress will come about. And it's only Peter, in some ways, who can do that back and forth, because Peter is by definition located at the center, right? And yet it's in this eccentric mission that Peter tends to the flock at large. And that's the kind of particular way in which Peter's stewardship is lived out. So, I mean, Balthasar, I think it's clear to me, is less interested in using that eccentricity for the purposes of discipline, although that may be very necessary at a particular moment, right? Then he is to say, how can the church keep being aware of itself as universal, right? I mean, in other words, I don't know, who else can take responsibility for the universality of the church than Peter, I think, is kind of where this is headed. And eccentricity is the way that Peter sort of shares that mission or exhibits that mission for the whole church and displays that universality to the church itself. Yeah, and then synodality, I don't know, okay, this is a big topic, of course, right? But, I mean, Francis wants to say that everybody, right, should be involved in this process. James should speak to synodality sooner than I should, I think. But I do think that, yeah, the constellation, as I see it, has a certain usefulness to us in our synodal moment, right? Because we have to be able to go into conversations about not only what the church should do, but who the church is, with an awareness of the variety of roles and missions and types that already and always exist within the church. And if the constellation business can help us kind of have a synodal conversation in that way, then yeah, it's useful at this moment. But I mean, we should talk more about it.
Thanks, Travis. And we have some questions from people online. The first one is for Professor Rojas, and it's, in Rahner's works, he's very much concerned with anthropology. In your opinion, how does he apply Ignatian spirituality to human dignity and to freedom?
Thank you for the question. I don't know how to look at the camera.
I should have said, that question is from Christine Mock.
Thank you, Christine. Well, first of all, usually people say it's important, the anthropology also in Ignatian spirituality, because the principle of foundation starts with the human being is created to serve and pray, praise God, etc. I would say we should nevertheless take care that the anthropology of Rahner, some scholars say, is theocentrical too. The very definition of the human being from Rahner is a being who is oriented toward God. And this is like the very relation between God and the human being. So they are intertwined. From this point of view, well, liberty, freedom is a very important concept for Rahner too. There is a big theology of freedom of Rahner. The title is very nice, it's Grace as Freedom. So, and it's 1968. The year says a lot. So, the idea is the grace, God's grace makes the human being free and enables the human being for being free, and the freedom of the human being aims to love and to serve. And so in Ignatian form, I would say there are a connection, and this is the way in that the human being ultimately find his salvation or the salvation.
Thank you. It's all, I would think it's the logic is, if God is self-communicating, that also there must be something in us to receive the communication. So God creates in us the capacity to receive Him, and that's our dignity and our freedom.
This is even the very definition of the human being is the being capable of receiving
exactly
this self-communication.
But it's in the logic of grace.
Yes.
So we're coming up to the time, and we just have a very, very big and interesting question. I think it's certainly addressed to the speakers. I suspect it'll keep us going well into lunch, but I'm going to allow it, and it's from Xu Sang Wu. Following the preceding question, which we've just been dwelling on, how does Rahner's anthropology differentiate human beings from artificial intelligence, and other non-human creatures? In particular, to what extent is this distinction shaped by his engagement with Ignatian spirituality? Over to you. You have 7 minutes.
So much to say about that. But, well, thank you for the question too. The category Rahner uses is spirit, and it's interesting because there are some articles also if other beings outside the earth are also find salvation in Christ or so. For Rahner, the decisive category is spirit, and spirit is the capacity to transcend him or other selves, ourselves. And I think this is the point for other beings, non-human beings. Is there spirit or not? I must say this is also a limit, I think, in Rahner's theology. When we see his theology from an ecological point of view, probably Rahner concentrates too much in the human being and sometimes forgot the whole creation, the whole world, or incorporate the world through the human being. So the human being being such a priest of the whole creation, a mediator at the end, Jesus Christ as the mediator, but in Jesus Christ the humanity as mediator for the whole creation, for salvation. I think today this is not enough, and there are very interesting approaches like Elizabeth Johnson for trying to understand the relation between God and the whole creation, or between God and every being, and this might be a more creative and interesting way.
It sounds in some ways a very optimistic view of approaching the question. I'll take the more pessimistic view in Balthasar's voice, because to return to the question about exousia, it's very specifically an anti-demonic authority that is granted in Mark. And for Balthasar, the demonic is characterized variously as that which scatters rather than gathers, right? That which knows the way of man, but not the ways of God. That which insists upon itself and drives into rebellious and insubordinate factionalism. And I wouldn't be at all surprised to find Balthasar, if he were alive today, reflecting on the demonic potential of artificial intelligence in some form or another. And I think the true authority over such a technology or tool will prove itself in the ability to harness it to properly communal and human ends. And I mean, who knows where this goes, but this does seem to be something that the new Pope is very much thinking about, and it will be interesting if Peter has a role to play in this in the next few years.
I think it's time for lunch, so thank you to both you, Hernan, and also to you, Charles. But thank you to all the speakers this morning. I think we've really opened up the topic in a very wonderful and deep way, so thank you.